While we've slept, the Chinese Communist Party has been wide awake. Within the last several years, China has achieved a strategic breakout, rapidly increasing its nuclear arsenal and seeking parity with our own. China is accomplishing this task with relentless speed and efficiency, and it's now on track to at least double its nuclear warheads by 2030. This is not a shift that we can continue to ignore. China's saber rattling, it is backed now by their massive and their growing defense budgets. And this underhanded foreign policy betrays the nation's true intentions. We should have woken up to those intentions. And the Chinese nuclear program, let's be honest, about 10 years ago. But at the very least, now that we are now again facing a great power competition, we cannot, we must not allow ourselves to drift back to sleep and into complacency. You know, there's plenty of blame to go around. Presidential administrations and Congresses, both red and blue, they failed to prioritize our nuclear deterrent. We've seen this with painful clarity in the Biden administration. This administration has failed to fully capitalize on the progress of the Trump administration's 2018 Nuclear Posture Review. Last year, the Strategic Posture Commission produced an authoritative, bipartisan assessment of our current nuclear posture, as well as recommendations for our arsenal's modernizations. As you know, these recommendations were comprehensive, covering the United States nuclear strategy and posture, conventional capabilities, and the defense industrial base. Earlier this year, I introduced the bipartisan Restoring American Deterrence Act to address some of the shortcomings that were highlighted in that report. This act would require the department to reassess our nuclear force posture, including a requirement to plan for the deployment of additional ICBMs. The bill would also restructure how the department oversees and coordinates on nuclear matters and improve NNSA management processes. Further, it seeks to build back our atrophied workforce. We cannot execute programs of record, much less build and maintain a proper nuclear deterrent without a skilled workforce. And that's why the bill requires the Secretary of Defense to work with the Departments of Energy, Labor, and Education to develop a strategy to promote a skilled nuclear manufacturing and vocational trade workforce. The Senate's version of this year's NDAA includes several key provisions from my Restoring American Deterrence Act. As you know, the NDAA is a product of bipartisan collaboration and debate, and I believe we've seen that really grow in the last few years. My colleagues and I overwhelmingly agreed that effective deterrence demands change. This includes the changes outlined in the Restoring American Deterrence Act. It also includes the development of new weapons that fill known capability gaps, like the nuclear-armed submarine-launched cruise missile, commonly known as SLCM. Congress has, on a bipartisan, bicameral basis, supported the development of this system, despite the strong objections of some in the Biden administration, because we understand the need for SLCM is clear. I'll work to ensure that these provisions are included in the final reconciled fiscal year 2025 NDAA and to see the President sign that into law. But this effort must continue long after this year's NDAA has passed. Legislating alone, it's not going to solve the problem. The new presidential administration must implement these changes and prioritize the continued modernization and the expansion of our nuclear deterrent. It is not something we can delay for the next 5 years. It is something that we must prioritize now and never again forget for the sake of America's security and prosperity. America's security is a bipartisan concern that requires bipartisan commitment. Unfortunately, some are still asleep. They dream of the day when China, Russia, and North Korea decide that they want world peace. The day our enemies voluntarily dismantle their nuclear programs because America has done the same. We need to be clear on this. That is a fantasy, a utopian dream world. We've seen this worldview most recently manifest in calls to terminate the Sentinel program, which will replace the rapidly aging Minuteman III. Some even argue that based on its cost and danger to Americans, we should abandon that entire leg of the nuclear triad. Well, Sentinel has its challenges, to be sure, but the department determined correctly that the Sentinel remains essential to our national security and that, quote, there are no alternatives to the program which will provide acceptable credibility to meet the joint requirements at less cost, end quote. We will address Sentinel's challenges, identify the best path forward, and do everything possible to emplace Sentinel as soon as we can. The threat environment demands nothing less. We need robust nuclear capabilities, not for the world we wish for, but for the world that actually exists. And that world is an increasingly perilous place. At all costs, we must stay alert, not make decisions based on the dream of a world that ignores these realities. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher said it well in 1987. A world without nuclear weapons may be a dream, but you cannot base a sure defense on dreams. A world without nuclear weapons would be less stable and more dangerous for all of us. As the new axis of Russia and China emerges, let's heed her wisdom and encourage others to heed it as well. If we invest now in our future security, the United States can face the threats of China and of Russia and of North Korea with confidence. If we do not, the United States will stumble, unprepared, unguarded, into an uncertain future. Thank you.
Senator, thank you for those insightful comments. I know you have to depart in just a few moments, but if I could, I'd just like to pull the thread on Sentinel. As we all know, it is a program that's having real cost and schedule overruns. The department is trying to address those, and they'll get some innovative ways. But wearing your hat of a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, what's the role of Congress in helping the departments ensure that this capability is fielded within the time frame that's necessary to prove a credible deterrence?
I think, first of all, Bob, we need to recognize that Sentinel has to move forward. We cannot continue to have a life extension program for a Minuteman III that was never designed to last as long as it had. So in order for that program to move forward, it's going to take congressional oversight. I know all of you in this room are probably well aware of the challenges we face with that program. I am very pleased that the department has come out strongly in support of the Sentinel program. It is the only program that we currently have, or that we even know about into the future, that has the capabilities for us to have a strong third leg of the triad, and I believe a very secure leg of the triad as well. When we look at, first of all, oversight of Congress in this, I think, first of all, we have to make sure that we have all of the stakeholders talking to each other. That doesn't always happen with government and with industry and with Congress and with the department and with the administration, but that's really what it's going to take here, is to be able to have the Air Force talk to the contractors, to be able to talk again to Congress, and continue for us to have oversight. I think one thing to remember on this program, obviously inflation hit. This is the most costly project ever by the Department of Defense, by billions and billions and billions of dollars. So when you had inflation hit, that obviously added costs. Another part that I think we have to be aware of is in the original plan, there was the idea that some of the Minuteman III silos could be refurbished and used, but then when contractors got on the ground in Nebraska, in the Panhandle, where this is happening, the first leg to happen, they found that wasn't necessarily going to be a workable way forward. So that added additional cost as well. But I think the main message I think we need to get across is that the Sentinel program is what we need. And the program's capabilities are going to be able not just to address the threats that we have in the near future, but also for the years out as well.
Great. One last question. Earlier this year, the Strategic Posture Commission issued its final report to Congress, noting that the current program of record was necessary but insufficient to field a credible deterrent to our adversaries. As you think about this in the Restoring American Deterrence Act with Senators Wicker and King, how do you conceptualize what a sufficient nuclear deterrent might look like that's different from the program of record? Do you have that sense in your mind of what are some of the contours of that?
You know, I touched on that in my comments, and what we all need to keep in mind is that times have changed. Yeah. Times has changed, and we don't have just one peer adversary now. We have two, and that number will grow. And I believe the world's a safer place when the United States is leading, when the United States is able to project confidence, to project power, work with our allies, partners, and continue to show that we keep our word and that we mean business. To make people believe that in a deterrent. That's what a deterrent is. You have to have confidence. You have to have your adversaries and your friends know that in certain cases it would be used. That's a deterrent. And I think as we move forward with our modernization, we have to keep funding it, obviously. We have to, as I always do when we're in classified briefings and I hear from the military and the department, they give me dates on when things are going to be ready. And I always look at them and I go, that's too late. That is too late. We have to figure out how we can move faster while still maintaining what we need to have into the future. That that is something that, I'm going to keep pushing. And to be able to explain to the American people why we need a triad, why we need a deterrent, it's so we never have to use it. And it's so no one else, no other country will ever use theirs.
Great. Well, Senator, I know you have another engagement, but I want to thank you for joining us today and also for your leadership on these issues writ large. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I look forward to reading your report.
My pleasure. Take care. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm going to miss.
At this point, I'd like to introduce our next discussant, Dr. Matt Kranig. Matt is Vice President and Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and he's also the Council's Director of Studies, where he manages a team of more than 30 researchers and oversees an extensive network of non-resident fellows. His research focuses on U.S. national security strategy, strategic competition with China and Russia, as well as strategic deterrence. He's a commissioner on the recently completed Congressional Commission on the Strategic Posture in the United States. He's served in various positions within the Department of Defense and the intelligence communities, within the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations, and he received the Office of the Secretary of Defense's Award for Outstanding Achievement. He's also a tenured professor of government and foreign service at Georgetown University, and the author or editor of 8 books, including most recently, We Win, They Lose, as well as numerous publications. So, Matt, come on up. So, before we dive in, I think the Senator did a great job of laying out some of the strategic landscape and some of the changing threat environment that our nation and our allies are facing. We should point out that the United States hasn't built a new nuclear warhead in over 30 years. Our own nuclear modernization program, as you touched upon, is struggling in certain areas. Some estimates are that Russia has 10 times as many operationally deployed tactical nuclear weapons as the United States. We've heard about China building upwards of 100 new nuclear weapons per year. And we've seen Russia and China over the last 18 months rebuff all attempts at arms control discussions. And so we may be on a path where by February 2026, there are no limits on the size or composition of the various arsenals between the nuclear powers. And at the same time, North Korea continues to expand its own arsenal. And as Secretary Blinken said recently, Iran may be weeks away from having enough fissile material for its own bomb. This is making our allies increasingly uneasy. And some of them are questioning America's extended deterrence commitments to them, given the actions coming out of Moscow and Beijing and Pyongyang. And so today's special report recognizes that while a credible deterrent requires more than nuclear weapons, to include strategy, doctrine, declaratory policy, conventional capabilities, it does call for the United States to build an arsenal for the 21st century, as Mr. Morgan mentioned at the beginning. The report lays out what such an arsenal might look like, to include a slightly larger strategic force, to include potentially road-mobile ICBMs with the Sentinel, a larger Columbia-class fleet of ballistic missile submarines, a larger buy of B-21s that are nuclear capable. It calls for a larger and more diverse non-strategic nuclear arsenal to include anti-ship capabilities that are nuclear capable, hypersonic capabilities that are nuclear capable, and ground-based intermediate-range nuclear weapons. It calls for tailored deterrence strategies for China, Russia, and North Korea. It notes that the United States will maintain the capabilities and ultimately reserve the right to deny Iran from achieving nuclear weapons. It calls for an enhanced global nuclear posture to include the potential forward positioning of additional non-strategic nuclear weapons in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, as well as the positioning of nuclear capabilities in Korea in order to deter China and North Korea's aggression, as well as the establishment of a globally deployable, nuclear-capable F-35 squadron. And it notes that while we welcome arms control, we need to recognize that the prospects for arms control in the near future are probably dim. It supports a layered integrated missile defense architecture, and it notes that the United States should reserve the right to preemptively destroy an adversary platform that could deliver a strategic attack on the United States or its allies from orbit. And until these capabilities are fielded in the 2030s and beyond, because that's kind of the time frames that we're looking at, it calls for the immediate upload of warheads from the ready reserve stockpile to existing theater range cruise missiles. And finally, it notes that the nuclear enterprise that produces the fissile material that goes into these nuclear warheads must be put on a wartime footing such that it can produce 80 plutonium pits by 2030. I lost my last page. And 200 pits by that's fine, sir. And 200 pits by 2035. That is, thanks, Matt. You know, that's what the report calls for. And it's not to say that is the answer, but it is the contours of the discussion that could inform a future Trump or a future Harris administration. So, you know, my first question to you, Matt, is kind of similar to the question I posed to the senator. When you look at the cost and schedule overruns within Sentinel, within Columbia, within pit production, what do we need to do as a community to get the existing modernization program back on track? Is it more oversight, more money? Is it less money? Is it new people, cutting certain programs? How would you address this?
Great. Well, first let me say it's a real honor to be back here at the Heritage Foundation, often ranked one of the best, if not the most influential think tanks in the world. So an honor to be here. And Bob, congratulations on this report. And I know there are copies outside. If you haven't read it, you should. You've really done a tremendous service by really kind of writing a draft of the next nuclear posture review, and I hope that the next administration, whether it's a Trump 2 administration or a Harris 1 administration or anything else, that they'll make this the first draft of their nuclear posture review. So congratulations. So what can we do? And you know, one of the opening lines of the Posture Commission report was making the case to members of Congress that they have an important role to play in shaping public opinion, because I think there are experts up here in the room who understand the challenges, but I'm not sure the American public understands the challenges. And I think that's the first thing that our leaders, elected members of Congress, the administration should be doing, is explaining to the American people the threat environment we face. This is maybe the most dangerous nuclear threat environment we've ever faced. For the first time in our history, we have not just one, but two near-peer nuclear powers, other nuclear-armed rogue state. And so, one, making the case to the American people, and then two, explaining the strategy, why the United States has a nuclear deterrent, why the Department of Defense across several administrations has said that nuclear deterrence is the #1 priority of the Department of Defense. And then explaining that we need to resource this. And I think that if leaders made the case to the American people, then that could help members of Congress make it easier for them to give the resources we need. Because this, you know, on one hand, we are spending a lot on nuclear deterrence. On the other hand, the cost of deterrence failure is unacceptable. And as a percent of the defense budget, as you know, it's actually pretty small. So I think if there's one recommendation I could make, it would be for leaders to make the case to the American people so that we can get the political support we need to do what's in the Posture Commission report and what's in your excellent special report.
Great. So going back, rolling the tape back about 12 months, when the Strategic Posture Commission was coming out, which is another terrific document that, if you haven't read it yet, I would encourage everyone to read. It's a bipartisan report that came out with a series of unanimous recommendations as to how the United States needs to proceed on ensuring that we maintain a credible deterrent. You know, the language of the program of record is necessary but insufficient comes from that report. So as you know, as a guy who's worked on nuclear posture reviews in the past, and was one of the key commissioners on that commission, when you think of sufficient to deter the security environment of the 2030s, what is in your mind to include both the non-nuclear capabilities? And I think you and I would agree that we need more long-range bombers, long-range precision fires, air refueling tankers, a lot of stuff that people don't often think of when they think of deterrence capabilities. In addition to that, what other capabilities are in your mind?
Yes. So you're right that the language in the Posture Commission report says the program of record is necessary but not sufficient. So let me first start with the necessary, that the program of record basically designed in 2010 to modernize U.S. ICBMs, bombers, submarines, that is necessary. And there is bipartisan support for that across Obama, Trump, Biden. But still you have, recently we had a member of Congress writing an op-ed questioning whether we really need the ICBMs. Yeah. So I think reinforcing that, no, this is necessary still is important. But it's not sufficient, and I like in the report how you break this down. I think we could go through kind of strategic posture, what's necessary, non-strategic, theater nuclear weapons, what's sufficient, and then also missile defense and other non-nuclear capabilities. So let's maybe start with strategic. And so the Commission report does say that given the increase in the number of Chinese nuclear weapons, increasing number of targets the United States needs to cover with its deterrence strategy, the fact that Russia and China could, God forbid, conduct a combined nuclear attack against the United States, which raises survivability issues. The report strongly implies that we are going to need more deployed strategic nuclear weapons. So since the end of the Cold War, we've been cutting. Now, for the first time since the end of the Cold War, I think we do need to increase the number of strategic deployed nuclear weapons. And so, some people, I think, misconstrue this. And I know recently Jake Sullivan was speaking at the Arms Control Association and said something like, well, we don't need the number of Russian nuclear weapons plus the number of Chinese nuclear weapons plus one. Right. But nobody's saying that. That's not how the United States sizes the force. And so the way we've always thought about strategic deterrence is what are the targets that we need to hold at risk that will deter Putin, would deter Xi from attacking us and our allies. And so it's not what would deter us, it's what would deter them. And so as we say in the report, and you say it in your report as well, we don't have I think some people who study nuclear deterrence in college and never think about it again assume that, well, we threaten to annihilate a bunch of people in Beijing and Moscow, they threaten to annihilate a bunch of people in New York and Washington, and we're all deterred. Deterrence. But of course, that's not how we do it. We've always had held at risk what we think they value, which is their leadership, their nuclear forces, their conventional forces, war-supporting industry. And so essentially, I think the exact number we can't come up with here on stage. It can only be done at U.S. Strategic Command, but count up those targets. What are the number and types of forces we need to hold at risk, those targets? And again, I don't know the answer right here, but I do know that it's more than 1550, which is the current number of strategic deployed forces as laid out in 2010. The threat environment has changed a lot since 2010. And our nuclear posture is going to have to adapt to that. So that's on the strategic side. So I think the recommendations in your report make a lot of sense, uploading in the immediate term, but over the long term, plan to buy more strategic bombers, more strategic submarines to plan. And we recommend also in the report to think about a mobile option for the ICBM. So, I think we are going to have to, again, increase the size of our strategic deployed arsenal for the first time since the end of the Cold War.
So thinking about, so then the following question becomes, if you have all that, why do you need theater non-strategic nuclear weapons then? Because that's it, the SPC touches upon that. Probably, within this report, that's where the most divergence from the existing program of record comes into. So to those who say, well, if we have SSBNs, right? Why the ballistic missile submarines? Why would we need intermediate range or medium range theater nuclear systems?
Well, we're seeing this right now in Ukraine, that the greatest risk of nuclear war isn't that Xi or Putin wake up one day and say, yeah, I think I'm going to launch a full-scale, bolt-out-of-the-blue nuclear strike against the United States today. The most likely path to nuclear war would be conventional war, like we're seeing now in Ukraine, or if China were to attack Taiwan. And especially if that's failing, Xi or Putin might decide, maybe using one or two or a small number of nuclear weapons would be enough to get the United States, get NATO to back off. And so we do need the ability to also deter limited nuclear attack. And so an important point, backing up a little bit, one of the things we recommend in the report is that we don't need to fundamentally rethink nuclear strategy. We think that our nuclear deterrence strategy has worked. So if you go back to the Cold War, the way we thought about this is we did have non-strategic nuclear weapons in Europe and in Asia to deter at those lower levels of escalation. So the logic there then is if Putin thinks he can use 1 or 2 nuclear weapons and get away with it, we want to disabuse him of that notion. That if you use a low-yield nuclear weapon on the battlefield in, say, Estonia, that our only options are not suicide or surrender. We could either back down and say, oh my gosh, he just used a nuclear weapon, or if all we had were strategic forces, say, let's launch a full-scale nuclear attack. We want to have those options in the middle to be able to respond in a flexible manner, and so that's where the non-strategic forces come in. And the Strategic Posture Commission report does recommend developing and deploying additional non-strategic nuclear weapons to Europe and to Asia. I think we basically leave it there, and in this report you go into some detail about what that might look like, and so I think that's where we do need to do a lot more work. I think slick them in is part of the equation, but I don't think that solves the problem. I do think additional capabilities, like you recommend, ground-based intermediate range nuclear capabilities in Europe makes a lot of sense. It's more of a land-based theater, so having ground-based capabilities makes sense. So yeah, I think, again, you do a service in the report laying out what that might look like.
So our friends in the arms control community would probably say to us, Matt and Bob, I understand the logic, but aren't you setting the stage for another arms race if you went down this path?
And I see some of our friends in the arms control community in the crowd today, so thanks for joining us. And I think arms control is an important tool of U.S. national security policy, and I think we need to have a strong nuclear deterrent and a strong arms control approach. The problem is, what do you do if you have adversaries that aren't interested in arms control? And Russia has essentially cheated on every arms control treaty it's been a part of recently. It's suspending compliance with at least parts of the New START treaty. We've never really had arms control with China. China's not interested in seriously talking at this point. So I think it could be valuable for the United States to develop possible proposals for arms control. And in fact, in the Strategic Posture Commission report, we say it could be valuable to have an arms control agreement limiting fractional orbital bombardment nuclear arms systems in space, which is something that China's developing that we have no intention to develop. So pursuing arms control there could make sense. So pursuing it makes sense, but we also have to be realistic. And if there's an arms race going on, we're not starting it. We're responding to what China and Russia are doing. And I guess final point I'd say here is that sometimes in the New York Times or other places, they make it sound like an arms race is the worst possible thing. Oh, this is setting off an arms race. I'd much rather have an arms race than deterrence failure.
Right.
And so, again, arms racing is not the worst case outcome. Deterrence failure is the worst case outcome.
So I'd agree with every word of that. And the only thing I would add is that this buildup from China and General Cotton, the U.S. Strategic Commander, testified earlier this year that he foresees expansion within the Russian arsenal as well. So if you posit that our adversaries in Beijing and Moscow have already started down this path in response to the United States simply trying to do a one-to-one replacement of our current arsenal, they're making security decisions based upon what they perceive to be in their best interest, which is perhaps has some input from our force posture, but in many ways is disconnected from what our force levels are. And so in that sense, we as policymakers and we as part of the community should similarly make the decisions that are in our best interest as a nation. One last question before we open it up to the audience. It's early 2025, and the Secretary of Defense calls in a group of people and said, what are the top 3 things I need to be working on? What would you say to him or her?
Yeah, well, since we're focused on strategic posture, I think my first recommendation would be the one I started with. Make the case to the American people. When's the last time a senior leader, a Secretary of Defense, gave a major speech to the American public on the need for nuclear deterrence, on the nuclear threats that we face? So I think that would be number 1. Number 2, I guess, would be implementing the program of record, making sure the resources are there for that. But then number 3, I think, would be tasking the team to say, okay, Posture Commission said necessary but not sufficient. What is sufficient? Tell me what that is. And I hope the first place they start is with your report.
Thanks. Appreciate that. At this point, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience, so please raise your hand. We have microphones in the back. And when you do ask your question, please introduce yourself and your affiliation.
Thank you so much. Hi, thank you so much for having this discussion today. My name is Eliana Johns from the Federation of American Scientists. And I just had a question regarding the non-strategic systems. So we know that we actually aren't particularly sure in the open source how many non-strategic weapons Russia has, but we do know that they're all dual capable, so we don't know how many warheads are actually on those systems. And we also know that Russia has had more of these systems than the United States for several decades. So would you be able to elaborate on why it matters now that we are looking at Russia's non-strategic forces, and why the lower yield options that the United States currently has, including the W-76-2 and gravity bombs in NATO, why that is no longer sufficient to deter an existing threat from Russia? Thank you.
You want to go first, and I'll go.
Okay, sure, I'll kick off. And thanks very much for that question. I'd say several things. One, the threat environment has changed a lot in recent years. So in the 1990s, the 2000s, even as late as 2010, it's hard to believe. If you read the 2010 Obama National Security Strategy, Russia is never once mentioned as a possible threat. It's mentioned as a partner for cooperation on counterterrorism and a variety of other things. Then 2014, Russia invades Ukraine. 2022, the full-scale invasion. Russia making nuclear threats in both of those. And so the nuclear threat environment, especially in Europe, but also in Asia that we can come to later, has gotten worse. Moreover, we know that Russia has this kind of scary nuclear doctrine that some refer to as escalate to de-escalate, but that it is to threaten limited nuclear use, and we're already seeing that. And then, if necessary, use non-strategic nuclear weapons as a way to get the United States and NATO to back off. And so right now, we're the victims of nuclear coercion, and Russia's nuclear coercion is hamstringing our ability to aid Ukraine. President Biden has been very clear about this, that he's curtailing America's and NATO's approach to prevent nuclear escalation. And so what we need is the ability to deter those nuclear threats. And then on why those capabilities are not sufficient, there are a lot of challenges with gravity bombs delivered by aircraft. So if Putin were to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine or against a NATO ally like Estonia, Russia has air defense systems. One, there's a promptness issue. How long is it going to take to get those aircraft ready to go, to fly from current locations into conflict zones in Eastern Europe? There's a time delay there. In addition, Russia has air and missile defense systems for an airplane that they could potentially shoot that airplane down. And then finally, these, come to the final point in a second. So I think having a system that's more prompt, that's more survivable, a mobile system. If you have something like a Slick-O-Min, you could potentially then put that on trucks in Europe, drive it around. It would be mobile, it would be survivable, it would be prompt, it would be better able to penetrate Russian air and missile defense systems. And then, some will say, well, what about U.S. Only capabilities? But I do think that it's important for NATO as an alliance. We've often thought that for NATO as an alliance to have its own nuclear capability was important. And so I think that thinking about what is the next NATO nuclear capability beyond the B-61 gravity bombs and aircraft would be important for NATO. So that would be my answer.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add to that is, in the 2010s, when there was still the same disparity in quantities of warheads, as Matt correctly pointed out, the Nuclear Posture Review in 2010 characterized Russia as a partner to combat nuclear terrorism. And today, that idea is kind of bonkers that we would actually partner with them to tackle a problem like nuclear terrorism. The almost weekly statements of nuclear coercion and blackmail against NATO coming out of Moscow changes the equation fundamentally. And the second thing I'd say is those weapons, and I credit FAS for doing great work on laying out, what those numbers look like in an unclassified setting, is that, those weapons, by and large, are still where they were when the Berlin Wall fell. In Germany and Italy and the Netherlands and so forth, when they were at the front lines of the Warsaw Pact, in an area where a fighter bomber could get to the front lines and employ those weapons against enemy forces without having to do an air refueling. Today, the borders of NATO are 1,200 nautical miles east of where they were when the Berlin Wall fell. So even if you're talking an F-35 trying to deliver a gravity bomb, that's likely going to have to do an air refueling before it even gets over those Russian integrated air and missile defenses. And for that sense alone, you're going to have to think about updating NATO's nuclear posture. Heather.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Heather Williams. I'm from the Project on Nuclear Issues at CSIS. I actually have a different question for each of you, if that's okay. So for Bob, a question about arms control. I was really fascinated to see that you kind of opened the report by talking about arms control and the failure of working towards a world without nuclear weapons. Really interesting choice. And so I wanted to get clarification on two specific things. At the end of the report, when you talk about next steps, you call for, it sounds like you're calling for the immediate upload to beyond 1550. So are you suggesting that we abandon New START numbers before New START expires? And then also the report, I think, has some really interesting ideas about arms control and being a bit more cautious in what arms control commitments we go into. Could you say a bit about risk reduction, though? As we are in an era of rising nuclear risks, what are some immediate steps that could be taken in that direction? And for Matt, thank you so much for the comments. I'm particularly appreciated your points about the importance of public messaging. To make a potentially controversial observation, I think a lot of people are getting interested in nuclear weapons at the moment, but on a much more alarmist side of the equation. And there's a variety of reasons about that, whereas I completely agree with you that we need to really be sending a stronger message about the importance of nuclear deterrence and national security. So could you just say a little bit more about what are some creative approaches that we might take to that? Do we need Hollywood to come out and make something like Oppenheimer, but maybe with a slightly different last 30 seconds of it? Are there any other creative ideas that you have in terms of how to get that wider public engagement? But thank you both very much. Great discussion.
So great questions, Heather. What I'd say is, when the Russians suspended New START, there's no clause in New START for suspension. And so one can make the argument that they're already in material breach of New START. I advocate for upload for what we have existing within TLAMs. And so we've got stuff within the Ready Reserve stockpile that you could slap on existing TLAMs and be ready to go. And my bigger concern at this moment is our theater non-strategic capabilities. So that's where I would go. Now, I know that non-strategics are not covered under New START. And your question was on New START explicitly. I would be open to uploading Minuteman 3 immediately. And what that says for New START, say what you will. I personally think that at this juncture, New START's a dead letter. So I'm not that concerned about it. But I'm more concerned about the non-strategic aspect of it.
Yeah, and good question. And I don't know, going to a middle-aged person who's been in this career for a couple of decades, I'm not sure that I'm the best person to come to for creative ideas. So it might be a good thing to task to our junior staff at CSIS or Heritage or elsewhere. So my main recommendation, and it's not creative, would just be for leaders to make a public address to the nation and say that this is the threat environment we face. This is the worst, maybe the worst nuclear threat environment we've ever faced. Say some of the things that Senator Fisher said, but how powerful would it be to have Secretary Austin or President Biden give a primetime address to the nation, making that case? So that would be my first recommendation. Hollywood, I think that would be great. Many more people are, I think, watching Hollywood movies than listening to presidential addresses. But I think Hollywood may be catching up. I was just thinking, I watched the Jack Ryan series of shows on Netflix, and I don't know if you saw it, but one of the seasons was about a Russian tactical nuclear weapon that was loose, and they were running around trying to find it. And there was a funny scene, and you'd appreciate it because they got the technical aspects somewhat wrong, because he was questioning this Russian scientist and said, "I heard the yield on this nuclear weapon is really small. Dmitry, is it small? Is it small? Tell me." And he said, "Yes, very small, megatons." He's like, "Oh my gosh, megatons! It's very small." So I think Hollywood is maybe catching up to the fact that nuclear threats are here again, but. I think that is part of the answer as well.
Yep. Right. Back there?
Our strategic arsenal, limited at 1,550 warheads, could already destroy all of Russia and the whole world. That is, we already have assured destruction. Why then is it wise to expand our arsenal? From Roberto Lochner from the Nuclear Threat Initiative.
And I'll maybe go first on this one. So that is a couple of points. One, fortunately, we don't have experience with large-scale nuclear war, so we don't exactly know what the effects would be. But this idea that we already have enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world many times over is probably not true. And in fact, there was a recent study that I cite in my 2018 book from the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, and they did an assessment: how many nuclear weapons would it take to, and this is getting kind of ghastly, but we are talking about nuclear war, did an assessment if the U.S. wanted to be able to kill every single Russian, how many nuclear weapons would that take? And their estimate was 140,000 nuclear weapons. And so we're at 1,500 right now, and so 1,500 nuclear weapons can do a lot of damage, but it can't destroy the world many times over. And as we point out in the Strategic Posture Commission report, it's not even enough to hold at risk the targets we want to hold at risk in Russia and China. So it's, in short, it's insufficient.
I totally agree with that. Over here.
Hi, my name is Jackson DuPont with the Council on Strategic Risks. And so just the logic that you all posited here today, and stepping, we're at a DC think tank, but let's pretend we're in Beijing and they're having similar conversations about the size of their arsenal. And where they're currently at, facing 1,550 nuclear weapons, strategic weapons for the United States, and adopting a little strategic empathy for their force size. Let's just assume that they say our current numbers are not sufficient enough to hold at risk U.S. targets, to ensure a viable second strike, and to be a survivable force. And let's assume that that is the logic that they are moving forward with, despite the lack of transparency they have in their arsenals and their doctrine. And so my question is, given that assumption, and given that perhaps that could be the reason why they are increasing their arsenals to hold our targets at risk, is adopting this kind of parallel track where we are increasing our strategic weapons, will we be left off in security dilemmas that put us in a worse position than we are today? Thank you.
What I would say is maybe you're right. Maybe that is the strategic driver for their decisions, but we don't know that. What we do know is that Xi Jinping has said that he wants a world-class military that, for all intents and purposes, can deny the United States access to the Western Pacific. He's told his military that they need to be ready to take Taiwan, knowing that that would probably bring them in conflict with the United States and a U.S.-led coalition in the Western Pacific. We know that just last week, the Central Committee said that they need to expand the rate of nuclear weapons production. And we know that the Chinese are building dual-capable theater-range systems, not systems that can range North America and hold our targets at risk, but systems that can take out targets that range from Japan to Northern Australia, and potentially to include take out ships that are doing 30 knots over the horizon in the Western Pacific. And that's not a deterrent capability that's meant to prevent strategic exchange between the American homelands and central China. That's a warfighting capability. Now, maybe they are being reactive to what they see as American provocations and so forth, but a prudent American defense planner and a prudent American defense strategist would say, maybe they really are gearing up for war, and they see nuclear weapons as a backstop in case they do lose a conventional fight with the U.S.-led coalition, that they can get us to back down and that they can exert dominance and potentially nuclear coercion against our allies within the region. And if that's a potentiality, then you need to build the force that is credible to deter them from going down that path to begin with. You may have a different view, Matt.
No, I agree, and so let's say there is that risk that we build up, Russia and China simply build up, we need to build up again, and let's say we want to avoid that. Then what is the strategy to avoid that? And I think it would be talking to the Russians and Chinese, trying to get them to limit their arsenals. Well, we've been trying that, and that's not working. So then what's the other option? Do we just leave ourselves vulnerable as they build up? And I think that's unacceptable. We can't accept a deterrence failure. So I think, unfortunately, the only choice we're left with is that we have to build the forces now that are necessary to deter attacks against ourselves and our allies. And then if they build up, then maybe we will have to do that again. And going back to this other point that an arms race is not the worst outcome, essentially the United States did outcompete the Soviet Union in an arms competition in the first Cold War, and I think the United States is better positioned than either Russia or China for another arms competition. So if this is really the road that they want to go down, then bring it on. We'll outcompete them. And so maybe if they see that this is not in their interest, that will be something that would bring them to the arms control negotiating table in the future.
We have time for one last question before we break. I think Daryl in the back.
Thanks, Bob and Matt. Daryl Kimball, Arms Control Association. Thanks for the invitation and the presentation of the report. I've given it about a quick 15-minute read. I've got two basic questions I wanted to ask you. One of the things that seems to be missing in here, was missing in the Congressional report on the strategic posture, is what would the price tag be for part of or the cumulative list of recommendations for augmenting the current program of record, keeping in mind the U.S. is spending about $756 billion over the next 10 years on the existing modernization program, and about a quarter of our procurement budget is devoted to the modernization program. So that's question one. Question two is, as you all know very well, the U.S. has an upload potential, putting more warheads on SLBMs, ICBMs, that could take us from about 1,670 warheads that can be delivered on ICBMs, SLBMs, or on strategic bombers right now, to maybe around 3,500 within 2 or 3 years with the crash effort. So the question is, what you seem to be proposing, Bob, in the report is augmenting the strategic deployed force, or at least the platforms that could enable that, beyond that capability. So what is the strategic military rationale for doing that, and, as it seems, doing it right now? So those are my two questions. Thanks.
Yeah. So as far as cost, we didn't put down. I didn't put down a number, but what I said was I think 1% to 2% of the defense budget could be reallocated into the nuclear modernization and nuclear expansion, whatever you want to call it. So that brings you to about 8 to about 16 billion. And if you look at reprogramming or recoloring certain dollars within the DoD budget, you can get there. And I think that if you did it correctly, precisely if you use weapons that are in the existing ready reserve stockpile, you could get there. Now, you could do an upload, right? You could go up to 3 Minutemans that are on the ICBM force, and I think that gets you pretty far to where it needs to be. I'm not jumping up and down to try to upload immediately Minuteman 3s when, given the state of trying to do the modernization with Sentinel and so forth, and those warheads are only going to be on there for 2-3 years. And potentially, potentially, if you're in a position where that's not where the central problem is, which in my view is the lack of a credible theater nuclear deterrence against China and Russia. And so that's why I put more of the emphasis on the non-strategic nuclear weapons. And as far as uploading on Ohio's, similar problem there. Then you've got to reopen shuttered missile tubes that have been shuttered for 10 plus years at this point.
Yeah, just two quick points. One on why I make the recommendations now is that, and this is what we say in the Strategic Posture Commission report, some of the things that we recommend, like buying more strategic submarines, are things that are going to be in the out years, but that we need to start making the planning decisions now to give us options in those out years. And if we don't start planning now, we may foreclose options that we are going to need, because we don't know exactly what the threat environment is going to be over the course of this new strategic force that we're building now. Yeah, we know that the Pentagon has said that China is building, what is it going to have, 1,500 nuclear weapons by 2035, but they haven't said that China is definitely going to stop at that. China might keep going, Russia might keep going, so we don't know exactly what the threat environment's going to be, so we need to now make the decisions to give us the flexibility to have options to deal with the threat environment we might face. On cost, we didn't cost out in the Strategic Posture Commission. We weren't asked to do this. But when Senator Kyle was asked about this, he was vice chairman of the commission when he testified before the Senate. He said, well, nuclear deterrence is the #1 priority of the U.S. Department of Defense. So this is the #1 priority. So Congress, if you want to deter a strategic attack on the United States, you do need to fund this. And I think that's right. And again, the cost of a deterrence failure would be much less than the cost of building a nuclear deterrent that the United States needs to not only protect itself, but protect the broader free world. And that's brought peace and prosperity to the world for the past 75 plus years.
Great. Well, we're about out of time. So thanks to all of you for coming and joining us here this morning, and thanks to everyone that was watching online. But at this point, please join me in thanking Dr. Kranig for joining us here today as well. Copies of the report are at the back, and we've also got, I think, a cool QR code that people can scan with their phones to download them as well. So thanks again. Safe travels. That was really good. That was terrific. So appreciate you coming out.